Welcome to Oh God, What Now, the politics podcast that looks to prosperous European nations like Spain and wonders what could have been if not for questionable officiating. If you're watching the show on YouTube, hello, we've been thrilled by the reaction to our appearance on video so far, and if you're still just listening in audio on your commute, you can go to youtube.com/ohgodwhatnow to find out what the panel looked like, and there's a link in the show notes. You can find full episodes there and more clips on our own YouTube channel. On today's show, crank up your wireless and we'll be done before the start of the light programme. Are we now trapped in 50s Britain? And if we are, how do we get out of the original austerity decade? For right-wing National Conservatives, the 50s are a lost Eden, albeit with Anthony Eden. But are the British people really up for a life of deference, family, and shutting up and getting on with it? Plus, if Labour had a clean slate and the cash to pull it off, how could they solve the endless housing crisis? Also, the panel will be nominating the heroes and villains of the week. So let's meet that panel. Tom Peck is the Independent's political sketch writer. He's a happy man at the minute because there's no politics to sketch. How you doing, Tom?
I'm doing good. How are you?
Yeah, not bad, not bad. So I hope you've dried your eyes after the Women's World Cup final. Serena Wigman is apparently being considered for the men's job should Southgate step down. But given that the women's team just made it to the final, wouldn't that be a downgrade for her to take on the flagging England men's team?
I mean, I have to say I'm not convinced she is being considered. I read all those stories with keen interest, and the chairman of the FA was asked whether she could, in theory, take over from Gareth Southgate, and he could hardly say, no, she's a woman. But I'm not convinced she is being considered. Would it be a downgrade for her? The answer to that is no. I don't want anyone to hate me. I'm just going to state something that is factually correct, which is that the men's game in the year 2023 is still a massive step up from the women's game. And the whole point that the women's game has made so much progress, and obviously the whole mission is that won't be true in 2033, but it is true in 2023. And one of the big things you could do to close that gap would absolutely be to see someone like Serena Wigman managing a team in the Premier League. That would be an absolutely tremendous thing for women's football. Like, the more people going back and forth between the game, like, i.e. off the pitch, means that gap is closing. And if someone like Serena Wigman can come from phenomenal success coaching women's teams to coaching a men's Premier League team or something like that, would be tremendous.
Well, the Everton job will be coming up soon, so maybe she can have a crack at that one. Did you enjoy noted soccer ball fan Rishi Sunak wearing an England shirt with the price tag still on it and telling the women's team that they'd left nothing on the pitch?
I mean, what a dork. I mean, that's the thing about Rishi Sunak, is that he's just a dork, isn't he? I mean, I don't find his sort of down-to-earth act as grating as I have in other politicians we have known. I mean, I think he does like football just as much as most people. He supports Southampton. I mean, he absolutely bodied the Australian Prime Minister during the Ashes with a gag about sandpaper, which is something that Cameron or Johnson would never have managed. Like, Cameron made a total wally of himself pretending to like football when he didn't. And Johnson, to his credit, actually didn't pretend to like football. And it might only be me, but I sort of find Sunak's hapless, sort of thick-of-it style, gaff-prone geekdom almost quite endearing, because it's just so laughably crap rather than like a sort of rage-inducing.
Yes. Hannah Fearn is a social affairs journalist for the iPaper and several other titles. Hello, Hannah.
Hello.
So there was another Labour backsliding again row over the weekend when first the FT reported the party was going to water down its plans to protect gig workers and the newly employed. And then Angela Rayner said, no, we're going to ban 0 hours contracts, going to end fire and rehire. We're going to end qualifying periods of basic rights. What is going on here?
Well, both things are sort of true, I think.
It's like Schrodinger's employment policy.
That they can both be true, because there is this document which the FT did see, and it clearly uses very, very different language to the language used when Sunak and Rayner were on TV talking about how they're going to protect people in the gig economy, people who want parental rights or sick pay rights from day one in their job. They were using very business-focused language. It talked about things like a framework to differentiate between jobs where you have a full-time contract and jobs where you're on basically a 0 hours, very, very flexible contract where you can be shafted. It also talked about probation periods with fair and transparent rules, which to any union member sounds like, well, you're just going to shaft me. As soon as you want to get rid of me, you can just bin me off in my probation period. So I do understand why Unite and other union members feel a bit cheated by this, and that it sounds very different to what was promised in the initial setting out of their plans for employment. But I do think that the truth is somewhere between the two. They're going to have to compromise a little bit in order to win the election, but there are some basic promises that they've made that will be in there. And this language doesn't prevent those. So things like not being able to be unfairly dismissed just because you're in your probation period in a job, say. So I think, a bit of both.
Right. Is part of it that in order to seem kind of not business hostile, you've got to adopt the language of
yes, definitely.
Going forward in this space, low-hanging fruits, energise the creative
forward.
space. Yeah, I'm reaching out.
Let's take it offline, which I've never understood because it basically means not in a meeting. So that is offline. It's a really strange thing just about terminology and sounding like you fit in with the people and that you understand their difficulties and finances and so on. I think it is just a document for a particular audience. But I do understand equally why if I was in Unite, I'd be starting to get a bit panicky.
Yeah, where's my scrambled egg and smoked salmon?
Same.
Comedian Matt Green is fresh off the Fringe with a pocket full of flyers. How you doing, Matt?
I'm very well. How are you?
Not bad. Did you have a good time?
I had a lovely time. Yeah, it was really nice. I was just there for a week, so I kind of got a real sense of it without being too shattered.
And you did about 30 million shows?
Not as many as I have in the past. I did 5 solo shows and a few extra gigs. But I went to see loads of stuff as well, which was lovely.
Well, while you were away enjoying yourself in the People's Republic of Scotland, a court in Germany has ruled that it's not going to extradite its prisoners to the UK because our conditions are too poor. Karlsruhe Higher Regional Court was supposed to extradite an Albanian prisoner to Britain, and it said that the move is currently inadmissible because of the prison conditions here. I mean, the Conservatives are always telling us how, prisoners have it too easy. It's like a bloody hotel. And of course, we've seen the kinds of bloody hotel they want to put people in. But is this the global Britain that we want the world to be seeing? You can't send prisoners here. It's too ratty.
Yeah, I mean, I did a bit of light relief after the Edinburgh Fringe and read the whole court decision. In translation, which included the response from the British government, which has got them into trouble. And I think it just shows that there is this real contrast between the German court system, which takes things very seriously and wants detailed information about what the prison will be like and how they'll be treated. And the government response it just felt like a press release that had been sent to a newspaper, and it had phrases like, we are delivering 20,000 additional modern prison places, the largest prison build program in a century, ensuring the right conditions are in place to rehabilitate prisoners, helping to cut crime and protect the public. It's like, yeah, sure, you can write that in a manifesto, but what is actually happening to this prisoner right now? Yeah. And it did feel to me it essentially boiled down to sort of the legal equivalent of going, hey, come on, it's us, we're cool, it'll be fine. And it does feel like, increasingly people around the world are going, no.
No, absolutely. By the way, thanks to listener Lord Leon Thirst on Twitter /X for spotting that story. We thought it was quite fascinating. First up this week, back to the 50s. Numbers released by the OBR back in March show that the UK is experiencing its largest decline in living standards since the 1950s. And like then, we've lost the international connections that used to give us not just power, but an international trading network. The New Europeans' John T. Bloom, which is an old-timey name if ever we'd heard one, summed up our predicament in a searing piece. The small band of ultras who dreamt of a return to empire, who think we still are a superpower, and who have no understanding of the meaning of the word sovereignty, have dragged us back to the 1950s. As my late mother once said, anyone stupid enough to think they want to go back to the 50s did not live through the 50s. But there are factions amongst the Conservatives who would quite like to return to an orderly, monochrome world. Not just the 50s before rock and roll turned up to ruin everything. And that worldview does resonate with older voters. Hannah. None of us in this room are old enough to remember the 50s, are we? We're far too young and beautiful. But we all know somebody who does, our parents, or in some cases our grandparents. What would they make of the idea that not only are things now as bad as they were in the time of rationing and the austerity itself, but that there are people in politics who raise the 1950s as a kind of an ideal for the way to live?
Well, I find this discussion really tricky because we're really not comparing like with like. Mm-hmm. And often, not in this piece by John T. Bloom, but it's the wealthiest doing the reflecting, isn't it? Yeah. So when they sit in Parliament and talk about how great economic benefits of the 50s and that period of social stability, it's not an accurate reflection of what it was like for the majority of people. My parents were born in the 50s. So my grandparents were, in their 20s and 30s, bringing them up then. And the world that my dad and my mum talk about when they talk about their early years, the age my kids are now, is so different in so many ways. The classic things, it's almost embarrassing to bring them up. But just as a reminder, sharing your whole family's bathwater, one bath a week. My mum lived in a one-bedroom flat, council flat with her family. So all 4 children, my mum, her sister and her mum and dad, shared a room up until my mum was 10. As a parent of young people. Could you imagine sharing your marital room with the 2 children up to the age of 10? These are now things that we do see in this country, don't get me wrong, but it's families living in temporary accommodation who are homeless are in those situations. And we rightly consider that lacking in basic dignity. So why we are sitting around, people in Parliament, people in select committees looking post-Brexit world, thinking about this as some kind of, potential social utopia.
Yeah.
It makes me quite angry. We're also in a situation where, as the only woman on the panel today, I'm just going to say it, women were often trapped in an insidious position, pinned to a breadwinner, poor access to contraception. I can't cope with any kind of harkening back to these traditional values because it's just, I think, by the grace of God that I was born in the 80s.
Yeah, I mean, same here. I mean, what I heard was from my mother and her sister, and all that they talked about is the relentless greyness of everything, the lack of anything to stimulate the mind. It wasn't just the rationing of foodstuffs and the drudgery of having to get hold of basic essentials. It's just stuff. Everything was shut.
Yeah,
Sundays were
Sundays.
dead. Nothing
The boredom.
happened. There was and the kind of the popular culture that was available through the wireless was such stultifying kind of wholesomeness. And you can understand why, because the generation that were producing it just wanted an orderly world. They'd just been through the war. But you can fully understand why that generation of my mother's age was sort of like desperate for anything, desperate for something to happen in colour in their lives. And now this is sort of held up as like, well, it was a great time, wasn't it? Very stable.
Also, people just misremember.
Yeah.
I think that in some ways I'm quite guilty of this about my teen years in the 90s and, Cool Britannia, Blair.
No, well, that was obviously great.
We've done a whole podcast about this, you and I, or no God, what else? Of course I'm misremembering it. Of course, for those people who weren't 13, 14, 15, there were huge problems in the mid-90s and it wasn't this great, utopia of progress and so on. But when you look at the past, this is all you've got. You've got misremembered personal details plus some stats. And you end up with this sort of false impression. And I really hate this focusing on the past rather than, pushing towards the future.
But politics is culture, isn't it? And you kind of see this stuff manifest not so much in a speech in the House of Commons or in a kind of manifesto commitment, but what you see is in places like boomer memes about eating corned beef and real bin men. And I had a strange
eating bin men.
Eating bin men. Well,
Right.
we were poor. We didn't know what we had no alternative. But I mean, I had a bizarre kind of interaction the other day with somebody on one of the kind of old photos groups on Facebook. And they were saying with a bare face, the 1950s was fantastic. There was no knife crime, no guns of any kind.
Oh
I just put a picture of the Cray twins there and said, your comments? And, the kind of retro redoing of, well, they only ever hurt their own. Untrue.
Oh, yeah. Oh, there wasn't as much child abuse. Yes, there was. It was rife. We just didn't care about it.
Well, actually, and, it's funny, I was reading a little bit about this today, that it was not completely unknown, but the veil was drawn. This is just too difficult, too strange.
Exactly.
Yeah,
well, people just they didn't deal with it. It seemed too embarrassing. We can't talk about this. Also, people were being beaten at school. Just so let's remember that.
Yeah.
State-sponsored child abuse.
Yeah.
So,
And yeah, it's
but
also...
I do love corned beef, by the way.
Oh, I love corned beef as well. I mean, I think you can enjoy corned beef without wanting children to be thrashed and abused. But you also see it kind of manifest in things like, Call the Midwife and Heartbeat and all this kind of stuff. This the idea that the past is not just a foreign country, it's a fictional country. Tom, I mean, I want to ask you, do you detect aspects of a bit of a 50s fixation in people like, say, Miriam Cates with her kind of natalist, kinderkirche cooker type of thing?
Yeah, I mean, Miriam Cates is kind of certifiable, but like her driving principle, if you like, also I don't agree with it, but I'm happy to explain it, is that women shouldn't be afraid to say that I want to be a stay-at-home mum, and that politicians shouldn't ignore or judge the millions of people out there, men and women, who live lifestyles that is unchanged by decades of social progress, who want the man to be the breadwinner and the woman to look after the house and bring up the children. Millions of people in Britain live those lives, and they do think in that fashion, and they think that and people like Miriam Cates thinks that politicians are judging them, and they shouldn't. But the trouble is, from that, those people also tend to think that social change, i.e. women going out to work, has been the thin end of the wedge for like moral decay in society, and that from that have come all sorts of other undesirable things like, say, gay people getting married and having children. But for the reason that we're talking about 50s nostalgia now, but it should also be understood the context of our discussion, which is we are talking about a government that is dying on its arse and is going to get kicked out. And where she and her like fall down is that they just don't realise that politics doesn't exist to serve people like that who are sort of doing fine. It's there to enable people who want to do more with their lives. And this politics of nostalgia, it pretends that you can solve problems by going back to a time before they existed, which you obviously can't. Like, you can't disinvent modern life any more than you can disinvent the nuclear bomb. And people like her and what she stands for, fascinating though it is to discuss, they're going to get a real shock from the voters. And this pandering to people who want everything to go back to the way things used to be, like, it died. Like, Cameron and Osborne came back in because they realised that the Tories were hopeless on that front, and that there was no way of winning an election without embracing liberal metropolitan values. And that very much still stands. We just had the spasm of Brexit that has sent us backwards. But the truths have not changed. Like, we have moved on. We just have a governing party that's going nuts because it's very, very near the end.
It's interesting. It's just a bit of a digression, but you mentioned sort of the idea of families living extremely traditional roles. So, you know, the mum brings up the kids, the dad goes out to work. It's entirely possible to do that, should you wish, and still have progressive views across the board on all kinds of other things. I know quite a lot of enormously progressive women with crazy progressive ideas. Some of them are even married to women who still want to have that role of, you know, I will take time to bring up the kids, but it doesn't define everything about me. And that seems to be the thing that Planet Kate doesn't get, you know, that you can have a multiplicity of ideas. It's not all determined by the fact of whether you fit, you know, the idea of a sort of 1950s radio workers' playtime.
As you say, I mean, it's not incompatible to say that you think that for you, as a mother, that the best place you could be is at home until they're 10 or 11, and still be progressive in every other way.
Be at home teaching them woke stuff.
Of course you can, but it's hard. So all people like Miriam Cates are trying to do is make politics out of something. And you can make politics out of it by saying, well, look, you can say, well, you know what? There are millions of families out there who still lead traditional lives and they want to lead a traditional family lifestyle. And yet they're constantly being told by The Guardian and told by the BBC that they're in the wrong. Well, all she's trying to do is make politics, not solve any problems. And that should be extremely obvious. And that's why it's not going to get her anywhere.
Matt, you know, when the 50s gets talked up, it tends to always be in terms of order, especially law and order. You can leave your door open. Kids could play in the street without being molested, all this kind of stuff, which, as we know, it wasn't strictly true. Particularly when you hear it in social media, particularly in, you know, kind of the places where the boomer post or the older person will congregate, very quickly it becomes clear that this is a proxy for, why don't you spit it out? Everybody was white. You liked it when everybody was white, didn't you?
Yeah, I mean, it's undeniable there's a lot of that going on. And, of course, to have been an adult in the 1950s, at this point, you'd have to be well into your 80s by now. So we're not talking about, you know, people who can remember it very clearly. It's a long way away, and there's very few people who have like living memory of that time as a grown-up, as someone who genuinely understood what was happening, not just someone who's, as you say, like a teenager or someone in their 20s who was just kind of excited about being in the world. And I always think that thing about you could leave your door open. I think, because there was nothing to steal.
Yeah. My mum says that quite a lot, actually. Yeah, it didn't matter. We didn't have iPhones lying around.
Yeah, I mean, I think that about school now, you know, that kids walking around with things that cost 500 quid in their pocket. And I think I went to school with like a pencil case with a couple of, you know, and I was going to school in the 80s and I didn't have anything worth stealing. So if you go back to the 50s, which, very few people had, this was before the consumer economy was really, you know, getting going in this country anyway. And so, there was a lot less. And I think, I'm sure there was a bit more of a sense of people sort of knew who everybody was in their area. But that can be positive and can be very negative as well. If you're someone
suffocating,
if you're someone who doesn't, I read, I can't remember if it was the piece you referenced in the New European or a different one, but it's people saying that after the war, you know, men for several years, they just went to the pub and they all wore the same thing. They wore their white shirt and their regimental tie. And it was I found that quite an interesting image of like, of course, people who went through the war and then they wanted to sort of express that they'd done something important, but they didn't want to be unconventional. They wanted to be very much ordered, and that was great if you fitted into that frame. But if you didn't, if you were a bit different, if you were maybe LGBT, which you wouldn't have said at the time, and I couldn't say it just then, or if you were obviously someone who'd come over from the Caribbean or somewhere recently, then those things were totally closed to you.
Mm. Do you think today's Conservatives would actually like the society that they started to build in the 1950s? Because, all right, the 1950s is a seesaw between Attleeism and kind of a kind of strange, complacent conservatism. But what kind of began then was the beginning of the consumer society, the beginning of the end of deference, the beginning of the end of people just shutting up and taking it. There were consumer booms on the way. And of course, the big thing was the massive cultural shift that the creation of rock and roll, the invention of the teenager, the invention of pop culture, which becomes the engine of modernity. It strikes me that the people who are talking up the 50s now would actually hate what happened at the end of the 50s.
Oh, definitely. I mean, it reminds me a bit of the that East German term, nostalgia.
Yeah.
The idea that they were really nostalgic for the time of being part of the Iron Curtain, and because the memory of people deletes the bad stuff and keeps the good stuff, as we were saying. And I also think, I don't know, the more I think about this, the more I think that the Thatcherism did so much to radically transform this country. And it's stuff that Tories, I think, would often, maybe secretly, quietly, would agree it was brutal and it was completely devastating to communities all around the country, and also great for some people. And so, yeah, Thatcherism still held up as this great thing. But I think quite a lot of Tories at the moment would say that it was good and bad, and there were things that were good. And in a way, it feels like that's almost what they're trying to do, is almost go before that. That's the issue. They want to go before the big bang, the city big bang, and all that stuff.
Well, I suppose the irony is that Thatcherism kind of managed to pull off a weird kind of bait and switch, in that she kind of, her rhetoric was of kind of, restoring that kind of ordered society. But actually what she unleashed was massive change and chaos.
Yeah, and individualism.
She herself couldn't even foresee the end of it. Yeah.
And in a way, because she almost feels like a sort of 50s character, she was the sort of classic sort of housewife character, even though that's obviously not what she really was in a sense.
The handbag.
Exactly, the handbag and the demure dress and all that kind of stuff. And it means that she was almost doing this incredibly radical stuff, but almost from a 50s perspective. And that, I wonder if that's almost what's getting confused in people's minds.
I remember when Margaret Thatcher was interviewed in Smash Hits by Tom Hibbert, and Tom Hibbert, readers of a certain age will remember what a very, very funny writer he was. And he asked her what her favourite record was. And she said, "How much is that doggy in the window?" And this is the early 80s. You've got 30 years of the greatest efflorescence in popular music, and God knows how long. And she chooses how much is that dog in the window? And Tom says, very interesting perspective there on capitalism and the dog. How much did it cost? But that was the kind of the limits of her sort of curiosity on that kind of stuff, wasn't it?
I have to say, I do sort of admire her for taking that interview on, though.
Yeah. Well, it was Smash It was very powerful. I think she also, to be fair, she also said Telstar by Joe Meek and the Tornadoes, which is a mad modern record, and God knows what was going on in Margaret Thatcher's brain. Probably sound
it's a note from a...
say Telstar, made in Britain, John T. Bloom, Hannah, who wrote this piece, it's a really good piece. We'll put a link in the show notes. He blames small-minded, climate change-denying Little Englanders for the return to kind of 1950s thinking. But isn't the problem that those are exactly the kind of people whose minds Labour has to change if it's going to make a difference?
Well, yes and no. No, really.
Okay.
I don't think that Labour does have to change anyone's minds on the climate. What it needs to do is win the election. And to win the election, it might have to say some weasel words, like we were talking about earlier, about things like the gig economy and 0 hours contracts. And it might have to do a bit of shape-shifting on that. But it doesn't have to do any shape-shifting on climate. Because while I think, people's employment contracts are very important, I'm not trying to undermine how significant stable work is, and it makes a huge difference to people's individual lives and quality of life. But the climate crisis is a much bigger thing. It's a moral global imperative. So you just have to do it. And to do anything, you have to win power. So that's that. It's not, I don't think they do have to really worry about some of these, retro idolizers or climate skeptics on that particular issue.
Tom, just to wrap up, John T. Bloom also writes that as the economic decline of the UK becomes clear, the public will demand an explanation. Why are the French wealthier than us? Why are the poorest 20% of the British poorer than the poorest Poles? Where is our trade with Europe gone? Why is the NHS on its knees yet again? Are you optimistic that, this sort of closed world idea will be rumbled by the electorate, that they can see not just what's gone wrong, but why it's gone wrong?
he is right that voters will demand an explanation, and they are already demanding one. But the answer will be that it is the Tories' fault. And I know that is such a boring thing to say and such a sort of glib thing to say, but I just think that is the answer. It's broken politics. And it's partly because the traditional opposition, i.e. Labour, and they are usually in opposition, rose out of the trade union movement, which means that Tories get to say with some justification that you have to vote for us to keep the socialists out. And a lot of people don't like socialism, so they have an inbuilt advantage. And the consequence is that you just then have people running the country that don't use the NHS, or if they do, they don't need to. They don't use the education system. And everything on that front that's got so much worse in the last 10, 15 years than it ever was under like Thatcher or Major has also coincided with a clique of people and kind of a class of people just getting richer and richer and richer and richer and richer, far more than they ever did before, and just not seeing the problem and not understanding it. I mean, Theresa May actually did, by the way. She used to talk about how hard life is for most people and most people just don't notice or care. And she tried to do something about it, but she was torpedoed by her own mistakes. But what is interesting is you can actually see right-wing Tories now asking the questions that you've just asked me. Why are we poorer than the French? Why are we this? Why are we that? And I think that they've realised that they're about to be turfed out for a very long time, and there will be no route back without any kind of honest reckoning on that front. I mean, they pretended that the answer to those problems would be Brexit related, and they've been utterly found out. But I do think we've sort of possibly hit, not economically, but we have politically hit rock bottom, and both parties will have to be honest with the voters about those questions for sure.
Both parties will have to be honest with the voters. My God, could it ever happen? Next up, our panellists choose 3 lions and 3 liars in Hero and Villain of the Week. Each panellist will nominate one, and I'm going to choose because this is an autocracy. Matt, who's your Hero of the Week and who's your Villain of the Week?
Well, I was tempted to do something controversial and say Donald Trump for hero. Just
Why?
because he's not going to do the Republican primary debate, and it means none of us have to watch it now.
That's a fair point. Yeah.
And just it sort of makes it clear how much of a complete nonsense that whole primary is. But no, I found somebody else who is a genuine hero, and that is Sarah and Mel Lewis of Mel's Chippy in Pennygroes, Carmarthenshire, who are offering £1 meals for struggling families over the summer holidays, and say they've been totally overwhelmed by demand. And it's a lovely story. It's on the BBC, and they keep the menu changing, and they give the kids healthy food, and they've started being supported by other people in the community. And it's one of those stories where it's like, it's sad that that is a thing that has to exist, like food banks, but great that it does in that particular community.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and who's your villain?
So the villain, kind of an obvious one, this one, but the president of the Spanish Football Federation.
Oh, what a creep. What a horrible, horrible creep.
Luis Rubiales. I mean, just the fact that, we all know what he did. He kissed the forward and on the lips, which was weird. And she said immediately she didn't like it. And then later she gave comments to the media saying, no, it was fine. It was a spontaneous gesture of blah, blah, blah. And you get a real sense that was heavily PR'd. And then he afterwards said that anyone who has a problem with it are idiots and stupid people, which was lovely.
Women, you're idiots and stupid people.
Including the woman that it actually happened to.
Exactly. And he has, I think, I've just seen before we started recording, I think he has apologised now. So I'm sure that he'll say that that's all over. But for me, it wasn't just that it was annoying. It was more that it reminded me of all those videos you see of like men proposing to their girlfriends during their girlfriend's graduation ceremony.
Oh, God, yes.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? It's like, it's just like, it's not about you. Just give her a minute. And it felt like that was an example of that, of like, it was her biggest moment of her life, and and then suddenly it's about him then, and then he's kind of slightly spoilt it. And it just, I found that very
said.
Two very strong contenders there, I think. Yeah. Hannah, you have to beat that. Your hero and your villain.
So my villain, perennial here, Suella Braverman, but really it's actually the Home Office, the whole Home Office.
All
because,
of them. Even the cleaners?
Just no, not the cleaners. The general structure of the Home Office, because obsessed as they are with the cost of migration and incoming migrant small boats, they're creating the cost, because we've discovered this week that more than 100 guards were recruited to the crisis-hit Manston Detention Centre, and they're all on full pay without being able to work, because they failed to do any of the security checks that they need to get these people to work. So they're paying 100 people now for months, full-time pay for doing, literally sitting on their backsides at home. Well, I mean, good for them. I'm glad that they're getting something out of it. They will do very hard work when they finally get in there. But it's just absolutely epitomises the complete failure of that government department.
Can they clean Legionnaire's disease out of pipes?
Well, I expect they're probably waiting to be sure that the Legionnaires has gone before they're allowed in as well, on top of the security checks.
Who's your hero?
My hero of the week, if I'm allowed to bring him up on this, what we might call rival podcast,
All right, then.
is Lewis Goodall.
Who's he? I've never heard of him.
He? On the very popular, but not as good as this podcast, Newsagents, he did an excellent rant this week about A-level results and the discussion ongoing about whether or not university is a profitable and useful route anymore. And he said, essentially, whenever anybody talks about how expensive higher education is now, how you can't be sure of your return and so on, and the marking crisis, everything that's going on in higher education at the moment, when people say that it might not be worth the money anymore, and that maybe people should think about a different route, they're not talking about their own children, and that the Prime Minister would never say to his own children, "Yeah, it's fine. Why don't you just choose an apprenticeship or a different route?" And I think he was absolutely spot on every little bit that he said, and I just think I'm glad that he's saying it in quite such angry terms, because I share his frustration.
Rishi's not going to tell the girls to go and train to be sparks.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, it's when Gillian Keegan
There's
said...
nothing wrong, by the way, with being a tradie.
Of course.
It's just that they're never talking about themselves, are they? It's like
Gillian Keegan said, in 10 years' time, no one will ask what your A-level results were. It's like, yeah, but that doesn't mean they're not important right now.
yeah.
In 10 years' time, they might say, you haven't got a job. Why haven't you got a job?
Also, I've got a story about that.
A-levels.
I once went for a job interview that I didn't get at a major UK university to be a guest lecturer on their journalism course. This was when I was working at The Guardian. And in the interview, you had because it was an HE institution, you had to declare every exam you'd ever sat, pass or fail. So I got a D at GCSE IT, and this particular job involved some, element of like social networking and so on. And this arsehole brought it up in that interview, but by which time I had a master's in journalism, a degree from Manchester, and, a career history. And he asked me why I got a D in GCSE IT, and I just thought, you absolute see you next Tuesday.
That could be a villain.
He could be the villain, I was going to say.
Yeah, if you're listening, thanks a lot.
Tom, you've got some tough ones to beat here. Who's your hero and who's your villain?
I have to say that on the script, my name is first, and I resent the fact that I've been asked last, because obviously I've gone for my villain, the absolute world-class pillock that is Spanish FA President Luis Rubiales, who kissed the Spanish women's captain on the lips in the medal ceremony, which was a truly awful thing to do, and he's apologised. But for my hero, I would like to go with absolute world-class pillock, Spanish FA President Luis Rubiales, because he has, because he has, in his own staggeringly dim way, provided a very useful public service, which is to remind everyone, like right in the middle of the very feel-good thing that has been the Women's World Cup, that people shouldn't get carried away, that the world, and certainly the football world, really is still run by absolute dinosaurs. They've gone nowhere, and they're an absolute menace. So he has provided a heroic act of public service by revealing his own cretinous stupidity to the world.
This is incredibly persuasive. So the judgment is as follows. Sorry, Brovman's, she can be the
Old
villain
news.
whatever you like.
Yeah.
So villain is definitely going to be Lewis, the unwanted kisser, chief of the Spanish FA. Clearly the absolute creep of the week. And the heroes, I think it's going to the chip shop women for their laying on the £1 meals to people who really need it. And I'm going to take a wild guess that there's a crowdfunder out there, because a story like this cannot possibly not generate a crowdfunder.
I'd hope so. There isn't one in the story, but then I'm sure that's just because the BBC aren't allowed to promote these
Probably
things. So
not,
I'm sure if you look for it, you'll be able to find it,
So sorry about Lewis Goodall. It was a good rant, but is he doing chip shop meals for £1 for the needy? I don't think so.
And he's not on here, so fair
And he's not
enough.
on here. They don't need any help. They're top of the charts. Next up this week, we're back on the housing desk if we can find a place big enough to fit one next to the kitchen sink. The whole country agrees that we need to build more houses somehow, somewhere, but nobody agrees on where, how many, or how it's going to be paid for. England alone needs 340,000 new homes a year, including 145,000 affordable homes. That's every year until 2031, just to keep up with current demand, according to the National Housing Federation. Yet existing house prices are at the lowest rate in half a decade and are predicted to fall still further by 2025. So assuming that Labour are on track for the kind of majority where they can actually get stuff done, how would all this stuff get fixed? Hannah, you are housing desk. The problem is enormous and yet weirdly, seemingly simple. Not enough houses, too many people. Can you break it down in a bit more detail? Where and what sorts of houses are missing?
I'll try and help. So, first of all, there's sort of two sides to the what's missing. It's who owns it and where do you get it from, and also what does it do. So, we obviously do not have enough social rented housing. It was all sold off through the right to buy. We didn't rebuild enough. But we also created under Cameron this false thing called affordable rent, which comes under the social housing criteria, but it's actually not affordable at all. It's about 80% of market rent, which is inaffordable to most people. So it's not useful. So there's a huge gap there. We don't have enough private rent that is properly organised through corporate private landlords. There was a good attempt at this to bring in some legislation to make this happen. Under late years of Blair and then Cameron, these things called real estate investment trust, REITs, they were designed to make sure that it wasn't just random hobbyists who were your private landlord. It would be big institutions, and pension funds would own these big developments, and it would mean that you could have secure long-term private rent. We don't have enough of that. We also don't have enough specialist housing. So if you're disabled or you become disabled, you can stay in your own home. On one level, you think about bungalows for pensioners, but there's a whole range of needs that need to be reflected in housing that we just don't have enough of. And we also don't have enough basic large family homes because people are sitting in their private owned home that they've paid the mortgage off in when there's maybe only one of a former family of 5 left because everybody's died or moved out, and but they're just completely under-occupying them. So they're sitting there and I hate to use this term because it is a bit crass, but it's sort of bed blocking them. So you can't. So families can't get in, and it is it's complex, but it is, as you say, sort of simple. We do need more numbers, and we need it to make it more affordable and accessible. And obviously, supply is part of the affordability question, but it's not the whole element. Yeah. I could talk for about 20 minutes straight, so I'll let you ask another question.
Well, I'm sure we'll come back to this, possibly on Bunker Dailies as well, because it is massively complicated. And I mean, housing policy itself is famously hard to communicate anyway because it's so variegated. Labour plans include more building on the Greenbelt, bringing back the housing targets that the Conservatives scrapped last year, making it cheaper to buy agricultural land for development, and what they call tilting the power in favour of first-time buyers. What does all this amount to? What is your thought as a housing person on the Labour package? Yeah.
Well, it is hard to communicate. You're right to say that because it is kind of complex. There's so many players involved, and the money strand is all caught up in lots of different places. And also because I think people who have paid off their mortgage in modern Britain, which is the majority of people who own their home, by the way, just don't know what it is to be homeless in modern Britain. They have no tangible feeling about what that might be like, and the bidding wars for rent and so on, and how hard it is to survive on universal credit if you need housing benefit. So Labour policy, as you said, all those elements that you pointed out, it's got all of the right things in there, but they are actually also all the same things that all parties have dabbled in a bit. There's actually nothing completely radical in it. And I think I would like to see something a bit more radical because the funding and the commitment is the problem. So you can say you're going to do all these little bits of things, make commitments, but you've got to actually see it through to the end. And relying on the private sector right now, which Tories would obviously do, to deliver a lot of this is just not going to happen. We've got an economy where house prices are dropping, materials are incredibly expensive, labour's incredibly expensive. It's not a economically sensible proposition to be a house builder right now. So they're not going to jump in and want to be doing this.
So if you were given the remote control to Rachel Reeves's brain,
yeah,
and you can do these radical things, what would they be?
Right, I've got a list of 4 things.
Excellent, 4 points. Tony Blair
Rachel
would love that.
Reeves, are you listening? Mm-hmm. I'm very happy to come and do a little bit of consulting on the side.
Okay.
Number 1 is to set up a development corporation with a target and fully fund it in some way. It's fine if you get private investment in somehow. I have no problem with that politically, but you need the government to be responsible, and setting up a development corporation to deliver the housing that we need is the only way to do that, because then you can be really prescriptive on the numbers of social housing, the numbers of other types of housing. And I do understand all the arguments against centralisation, and even Labour have said they want local authorities to have more control, but this is a human right. It's beyond now a debate about the politics of localisation versus centralisation. You've got to get it sorted. And it's happened before. The new towns were set up using development corporations. So there is a history of it. So I think that would be really good. So it would be government control, but expert run. And they would have to fit meet these targets.
You call it Great British Housing.
Great British Housing.
That's
I
great. That's a
actually
great
have no
acronym.
problem with that.
What
yeah.
a great acronym that is.
Brilliant.
Right. Number 2.
Okay, so the second thing is about the local housing allowance and housing benefit. So for people who don't know about this, housing benefit does not bear any relationship to the actual rent that you pay. Under Cameron, during the austerity era, the government decided that it was a massive problem that the government had such a huge housing benefit bill, and they wanted to do something about it, and they thought they had more power to manipulate the market than they did. Weird for Tories, since they love a free market. And they decided that if they reduced housing benefit and created this thing called the local housing allowance, which was, they said, loosely pegged to the local housing cost, they would, private landlords would just link their rent to that because they would want security of income. And that they could, by reducing the local housing allowance, they could slowly reduce local rents. So that's what they tried to do. They started putting a cap on housing benefit, essentially. And landlords, funnily enough, just didn't care. So they carried on charging higher rents. People got into huge trouble, with arrears and so on and evictions. Or private landlords would just stop letting to anyone who claimed universal credit or housing benefit. So it became completely separated, and we've allowed rents to spiral and people on benefits to have less and less. So something's got to be done about that. You need a complete overhaul of the benefits system. The government says it's committing 30 billion to housing. That's a stupid random round figure, and it makes no difference. You need to completely overhaul that system. The third thing is there needs to be a zero homelessness policy. So that was totally made possible in COVID, and I know that was partly because hotels were sitting empty, so there were loads of rooms you could put homeless people in. But actually, it's very possible to do that. All it needed was some minds on it and some money behind it. And this is a modern country. We want to be competitive out of Europe for some stupid reason. One way we can be competitive is to genuinely care about our people and to not allow people to slip into homelessness, that we actually act upon it. At the moment, we have a policy where, because of the shortage of housing, local authorities will not help people who are at risk of homelessness, who know they're slipping into homelessness, they're going to get evicted, until the day they're out on the street. This causes loads of problems for private landlords because someone's overstaying their right to stay in their property for ages, and it makes private landlords very angry. It makes private landlords hate people on universal credit even more, and it leaves people in this awful position. Private landlords are actually having to evict someone, which they don't really like doing, a lot of them. And also, more importantly, families being thrown out on the street and not having anywhere to go because the council won't support them until they are genuinely being thrown out by a bailiff. That can't be right. So let's have zero homelessness and creative policy to make that happen. And finally, we need to think about, when we're developing housing, we need to think more about our life cycle about housing and how we use housing. So at the moment, we talk about housing as an asset. We talked about that slightly earlier in the show. It can't go on like that. The way we live and where we live is part of our lives. It's as much as our health and so on. And we need to start thinking about it and talking about it politically in those terms. So we need pensioners to understand that they have a moral imperative to move when they're under occupying. And we need to think about building housing and having some kind of route through housing, that we expect to live in a small studio when we're single at 23. That's okay. And we should expect to have access to an affordable 4-bedroom house if you're a family with 3 kids. But equally, you shouldn't expect to be able to stay in there throughout, right to the end of your life. You don't have the right to just stick around. Of course, if you own it, that you get into a discussion then about land rights and property rights and
but
what
also
does it mean
incentives
to own. But we need a conversation, a political conversation where we talk about things about the housing as a part of life rather than a financial asset, because it's distorting and it's problematic. And if you're listening, very happy to talk to you about all of that. Labour government.
There you go.
In waiting.
So, Tom, there's a 4-point plan there. What kind of a political opportunity is housing for Labour? Could they fight an election effectively, primarily on "we will fix the housing crisis," or is that simply a hostage to fortune?
Well, they can promise anything, can't they? I mean, I sort of want to die whenever I hear any politics. I mean, God, I've wanted to die almost constantly covering politics for the last 7 years. But bizarrely, the thing that makes me want to die more than any of it is almost any time any politician says the word housing, because you just know that nothing is going to happen. I think if Keir Starmer fights an election campaign in which he promises to fix the housing crisis, you are quite correct. That is, I wouldn't even describe it as being a hostage to fortune. It's a promise that he will definitely not keep. I mean, I'm not an economist or a housing expert. I truly have no idea how you fix the housing crisis. There are many parts of it. To me, when I think of the housing crisis, I mainly just think that homes cost 5 times more than they should, and that's the problem that needs to be solved. But if you have 15 years of ridiculously low interest rates, 15 years is a very long time, you then have another whole generation who is hopelessly overmortgaged, hopelessly overexposed to a house price crash. And I don't understand how you can't have one of those demographics, i.e. the people who can't afford to buy one or the people who've bought one that they can't afford. One of those demographics essentially has to live with a ruined life. I don't understand how there is any alternative to that. So I have no idea how any politician can come along and tell you they're going to fix the housing crisis, because it involves screwing up the lives of one set of millions of people or a different set of millions of people.
Well, I agree with you in a lot of ways, except for obviously I would say that in the way you've just described it, you have sort of taken on some of the rhetoric of these years and years of the crisis that we've had, which actually not owning your own home is not a ruined life. But we have a situation at the moment where it becomes ruinous because the rental sector is so buggered. So if we sort that out and we make it so that you can have a 20-year fixed contract at established, raise each 2 years, where it's totally planned out for you, you know exactly what's going to happen, you can have a good, happy family life in rented. Not mortgaging isn't right for everyone.
I completely agree, but
be.
people do still want to buy their own home. They just do.
Yeah.
But partly because it's so shit to rent here. And,
Well,
that's not true in European countries.
Yeah.
I mean, a bit of news that came through today is that the rise in mortgage rates means it is now cheaper to rent a home than to buy one for the first time since 2010. Now, obviously, that won't always be the case.
No, but that's how it should be. Of course.
In the kind of in the shift of things, Tom, it is kind of bizarre that the Conservatives have managed to basically cut off the production line of their own voters. Young homeowners, turn 35, buy a house, start paying tax, start voting Tory. Just doesn't work anymore, does it?
Well, no, because there's a very, very, very serious financial crash in 2008, and the response of the Conservatives was to focus on homeowners, and they were very happy to see insanely rising house prices because it provided a full sense of economic security and political cover for growing economic doom. So they were very happy to make that bargain. Rising house prices let them off the hook for lots of things for a while, but they're very obviously on the hook now.
Matt, this is true, isn't it? Because it's enormously risky to embark on a radical house building on a massive scale, even in the kind of detail that Hannah's just described, because you put yourself right in the line for mail headlines saying the price of your house is collapsing, your nest egg, Starmer destroys your life.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, I think Tom's right that unfortunately housing value has become the only wealth that most people have in this country, if they have any, if they're lucky enough to have some, and that changing that causes massive problems in the short term for those people, even if it has long-term benefits in the long term, and the whole system is sort of set up to resist that. It just feels to me like the problem is that building new houses will annoy the people in an area who currently live there and help people who don't currently live there, who don't vote because they don't exist yet in that area. I mean, it feels like the whole housing policy is basically a sort of form of one, like a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, like a voter in a house is worth two prospective voters in a flat. Like we're stuck in this kind of loop. And I think, unfortunately, the political incentives are set up like that people love the idea of housing in theory. And then as soon as someone says, we're going to build a new estate down the end of your road, people are like, oh, well, yeah, not round.
What about
not
the
here.
view?
Exactly. And I live in North London. I've seen that happen. We've got, there have been various development attempts in our area. And the most angry I've ever seen people in our area is when people are trying to build some houses down the road and people go, no, we can't do that because there's a reason why this particular bit of green land is really important. And I think, well, is it? I don't know. I'm not really sure. But they've got the loudest voices, and so they're the ones who end up talking to the councillors, and they often win.
Hannah, Starmer wants Labour to be known as the party of home ownership. Can he wrest that crown from the Tories? Should he even want to? I'm going to guess you're going to say he shouldn't.
I don't think he should want to. I think he should know deep down that is not the way to solve this. And actually a kind of hard conversation with everyone about housing would be better. But he is going to do it because he's probably right that right now it's more politically successful. I guess, I don't know, it's a funny time to go through that because you have got this situation where because house prices are dropping, you do reduce the deposit barrier. So There's prospective Labour voters who don't own home yet, who probably would have voted Labour anyway, but they might be buoyed up by this idea that Starmer's the person who's going to get them finally on the property ladder, but it is going to alienate the kind of people that they need to win over from the Tories. So,
well, it won't matter because soon we'll all be living in Legionella-infested boats in various ports around the country, so it's all going to be fine.
It strikes me as being a little bit like the Lewis Goodall thing, that, like you said, that we've got this situation where if you get to buy your house, that's considered like the winning place to be. But there are lots of people going, well, it shouldn't be though. That shouldn't be the be all and end all. But they all own their houses.
Yeah,
you know, it's them.
It is. That's true.
And if
created
MPs just all had to rent for some reason, or rather than being landlords, a lot of them, then it feels like the conversation would be the other way around.
Yeah, we have created a system where it does feel like the barometer of kind of personal success. When actually, maybe that will change over the next few years because exactly as Tom described, we've now got this situation where people who have bought homes they actually can't really afford are going to suddenly feel the pain of that very tricky decision they made.
We've reached the end of the show, so it's time for Escape Routes, the books, the films, the music that our panel are listening to take their minds off the horrible absence of politics rather than the nightmare of politics at the moment. Tom, what's your escape route?
Well, it's nothing new, but I've belatedly got round to watching Slow Horses on Apple TV. I don't know if you guys have watched it, and it's just so good. Have you all seen it? Presumably you have.
Yeah.
I've read the books, but I've not seen the show.
I don't know it. Tell us what it is.
Well, the Slow Horses are like MI5's wrong-uns, and they work out of a shithole office where they've been banished for cocking things up. But they also inevitably end up back in the thick of it, and they get gamed and used by the big boys back at Regent's Park. And it's just so good. It's like Bond, but authentically British, like what it's really like based sort of quite crap, low budget. And
it's like Bond on benefits.
And Gary Oldman, I didn't realise this. He said it's going to be his last acting role, and he is so good in it. And it looks like they've filmed the third and fourth series, and I think they're going to come out at Christmas and again next April.
He's not that old. I'm not quite annoyed about that. I don't think Gary Oldman should be allowed to retire. He's a productive actor. There's plenty more roles in him.
He should be nationalised.
He should be, yeah. Hannah, what's your escape route?
I have just finished reading a novel called Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin.
I was recommended that last week.
It's absolutely brilliant.
What's it about?
So it's basically about friendship. It's about these two kids who meet, literally under the age of 10, and then become friends during their teen years, then lose each other and find again at university. And then it's about how they collaborate in their working lives. But it's also about video games. Now, I know nothing about video games. The last time I played a video game was Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2 in 1999. I am not interested. It's not my thing at all. This book has made me interested in the world of games, in game culture, in why people are invested in it, and what it means to people. And for the first time ever, I get why it's important to people. And I feel like not only is this an excellent novel with a brilliant narrative, it says a lot about America, and it says a lot about culture and people and friendship and relationships and work, all of those things. It also has taught me a lot about some of my best friends, a thing that I had never really accessed about them before. So I highly recommend it. And I never have any time to read at the moment. And as listeners know, I always bang on about that. I've got two young kids. I powered through this in about 4 days because I loved it so much. So yeah, highly recommend.
Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by
Gabrielle Zevin.
Amazing. I think the last video game I played was Cool Spot on the Sega Mega Drive in about 1991. Matt, what's your escape route?
Well, mine has to be The Fringe. That's where I've been for a week. So that was my escape route. Every year, people talk about it's getting too big or it's getting too corporate or the accommodation's too expensive, and all of that is true. But every time I go, it's just so inspiring because there are just thousands and thousands of people putting all of their heart and soul into their show, whether that's on stage or backstage or wherever. And the amount of sort of creativity squeezed into one fairly small city, really, and certainly the area that Fringe is quite a small amount of space. And it's also the only place you can go into a Sainsbury's any time of day or night and be queuing up behind an angel, a witch, and someone in full period dress, and just everyone's just fine with it.
You haven't been to Dalston?
Well, I have. But and it's just all time of day or night as well. Like it's just such an exciting place to be. And every time I go, I sort of come back thinking, it's great. And I was only there for a week, so I didn't get too sort of jaded by it all.
What was the best thing you saw?
Probably. Well, I saw lots of good stuff. I would say maybe Ahir Shah, who I know is
keep
friend
it
of the
in-house.
podcast. Yeah. His show. I mean, his shows are always excellent, but this year, his show I think is called Ends, and interestingly, it's about his grandfather partly, and part of it is about how he feels like he's learning how, or has learned how his grandparents and parents' generation sacrificed for his generation, and he's wondering about how he can sacrifice for the next generation because he's getting married soon and sort of thinking about that. And all of those questions suddenly became quite relevant in today's discussion, I think, that, you know, how do you ask old generations to sacrifice for younger generations? How does that work? And he talks about that in a very sort of moving and very, very funny, but also very, I found very affecting way about like how his grandfather sacrificed so much for so many years for his family. And then eventually towards the end of his life, sort of decided to do stuff for himself. And it's a really fun, it's a really interesting story.
Fantastic. Well, my escape route is music, and it's not a new record. It came out at the start of the year. It's by Confidence Man, and it's called Tilt. And it is a record of big, summer, shiny pop music. It is about partying and going out. And the reason I've started listening to it again is because summer is ending, and you're getting that sort of weird feeling where, you know, it's getting dark a little bit earlier. And this record really reminds me of 1990, which is the first time I was in London, which was an incredible summer. And the records that came out at that time, that when house music and pop music had become the same thing. So you had incredible records like 7 Ways to Love by Cola Boy or Fascinating Rhythm by Bass-O-Matic, great pop hits. And Confidence Man are very much like that. They're basically the Australian Delight. And so every other song sounds either like Groove Is in the Heart or it sounds like What Is Love. Everything's got a tambourine on it. The ones I haven't got tambourines, I've got a piano going ding, 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 ding. It's just up, up, up. It's not trying to tell you the meaning of life. And because it's not trying to tell you the meaning of life, it is showing you the meaning of life. So it's just a fantastic, fantastic record. It's Tilt by Confidence Man, and I recommend it to anybody with ears. And that's the end of the Tuesday edition of Oh God, What Now? Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you.
And thank you, Tom.
Thank you very much.
Oh God, What Now? We'll be back on Friday or Thursday if you're a Patreon backer. You can now, if you want to, go straight to YouTube and watch all of this in human technicolor glory as well as listening to it. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.